When you are weak, appear strong. Sun Tzu, The Art of War, over 2,000 years ago. Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu wrote a simple but devastatingly effective principle in The Art of War. Perception matters more than reality. Strength is not just what you possess, is what others believe you possess. Weakness is not simply the loss of power, is the moment your enemies believe you have lost it. While the art of war is most commonly associated with ancient battlefields, swords, and armies, its lessons were never meant to remain confined to warfare alone. Over centuries, its logic has been applied to diplomacy, economics, psychology, and empire building. In the modern world, wars are no longer fought only with tanks and missiles. They are fought with narratives, financial systems, sanctions, and carefully choreographed displays of power. And this raises a critical question. What if the recent U.S. military buildup off the coast of Venezuela is not about Venezuela at all? What if it is a strategic performance, a calculated display of strength, at a moment when much of the world increasingly perceives the United States as an empire in decline? In recent years, the global image of American dominance has taken visible cracks. China has risen from a regional manufacturing hub into a full-spectrum geopolitical rival. Russia has endured sanctions, isolation, and war, yet remains standing militarily active and strategically relevant. Iran has survived decades of pressure, assassinations, and economic warfare without collapse. Israel, backed unconditionally by Washington, has struggled to decisively defeat Hamas in the besieged Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, inflation continues to erode the purchasing power of the US dollar at home and abroad. Individually, each of these developments could be explained away, but together, they form a larger narrative, one that many around the world have already accepted. The United States is no longer invincible. Despite still possessing the world's most powerful military and the largest GDP on paper, perception has shifted. Allies are hedging, rivals are pushing boundaries, neutral nations are exploring alternatives, and crucially, this sense of decline is not only felt abroad, it is deeply felt inside the United States itself. This internal crisis of confidence laid the groundwork for one of the most consequential political movements in modern American history. Donald Trump did not rise to power with complex policy platforms or detailed ideological frameworks. He rose on a single, emotionally charged message: "Make America Great Again." The slogan itself carries an implicit admission. America is no longer great, and more importantly, that Americans feel they have lost something fundamental: status, power, security, and respect. When Trump was re-elected, this narrative of decline transformed into a governing doctrine. The goal was no longer merely to reassure domestic audiences, was to reassert dominance globally. In a remarkably short span of time, the United States escalated tensions across multiple fronts. It deepened military cooperation with Israel during strikes on Iran. It continued arming Ukraine, further antagonizing Russia. It expanded sanctions to unprecedented levels, targeting nearly half the planet. Trump even floated ideas once considered unthinkable, threatening the annexation of Canada and Greenland, and symbolically renaming the Department of Defense back to the War Department. This was not subtle diplomacy. This was empire signaling. In its latest display of force, Washington turned its attention south. Venezuela, a massive U.S. naval fleet, began assembling off its coast. A no-fly zone was imposed. Intelligence leaks, media narratives, and official statements all began pointing in one direction: escalation. To many observers, this looked like the familiar prelude to another regime change operation. But this time, the stakes are far higher. This is not Iraq. This is not Libya. This is not Afghanistan. This is a confrontation that may determine the future of the global economic system itself. Before bombs fall, headlines appear. This has been the pattern of every modern American intervention. The first battlefield is not land or air, it is the information space. Public opinion must be conditioned. Narratives must be framed. Consent must be manufactured. Understanding this process allows one to see wars forming long before the first missile is launched. This is why analyzing media bias, ownership, and framing is essential, not optional. Different outlets can report the same event while telling completely different stories. One side emphasizes skepticism and restraint. Another uses decisive language that frames violence as necessary and justified. Neither version exists in isolation. Each serves an interest. War begins when one version becomes dominant. To understand why Venezuela is once again in Washington's sights, we must look beyond the present moment. Venezuela is not just another Latin American country. It carries the ideological legacy of Simón Bolívar, the revolutionary who fought to liberate South America from European colonial rule. Bolívar envisioned a unified, sovereign continent strong enough to resist external empires. That vision directly conflicted with the United States' own doctrine. Since the 19th century, Washington has treated the Western Hemisphere as its exclusive sphere of influence under the Monroe Doctrine, a policy that, in essence, declares this half of the world belongs to us. Venezuela's historical identity alone places it in opposition to American imperial strategy. But ideology is only half the story. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iraq, more than the United States. At least $18 trillion in oil lies beneath Venezuelan soil land. That figure does not include vast reserves of gas, gold, iron, and other strategic resources. For much of the 20th century, these resources were controlled by a small domestic elite, aligned with Western corporations. Wealth flowed outward, while poverty remained entrenched at home. Then came the oil shocks of the 1970s, followed by the devastating oil glut of the 1980s. When prices collapsed, Venezuela's debt exploded. The country was pushed into austerity, privatization, and IMF control. The result was economic collapse and social rebellion. Out of this chaos emerged Hugo Chávez. A former military officer with revolutionary charisma, Chávez did not offer minor reforms. He offered transformation. He nationalized Venezuela's oil industry not symbolically, but materially. Oil wealth was redirected into healthcare, education, housing, and food programs. He explicitly tied his movement to Bolívar's dream of sovereignty and independence. This was unacceptable to Washington, because when a country with the world's largest oil reserves declares that those resources belong to its people, not Exxon, not Chevron, not the IMF, it challenges the foundations of American power. And that power rests on two pillars: the US dollar control of global energy for decades. Oil has been priced and traded almost exclusively in US dollars. This system, the petrodollar, what allows the United States to run massive deficits without collapse. But that system is unraveling. China, Russia, Iran, and the broader BRICS bloc are actively constructing an alternative financial order. Oil deals are increasingly being settled in yuan, rubles, and other currencies. If major oil producers abandon the dollar, American financial dominance collapses. And this is where Venezuela becomes critical. Whoever controls Venezuelan oil controls leverage over the future global energy market and, by extension, the future reserve currency. From Washington's perspective, Venezuela is no longer merely disobedient. It is strategically dangerous. Its alliances with China, Russia, and Iran threaten the petrodollar system itself. Its integration into BRICS would accelerate the transition to a multipolar world. This is why U.S. pressure has escalated so rapidly. Sanctions, assassinations, covert operations, military positioning, the deployment of aircraft carriers, and the imposition of no-fly zones are not symbolic gestures. They are preparation. This is not about democracy. This is not about corruption. This is not about drugs. This is about who controls the operating system of the global economy. Over the last 2 decades, the United States has repeatedly attempted to manufacture an alternative leadership for Venezuela. When direct military intervention was politically risky or strategically premature, Washington relied on a familiar tactic: recognize an opposition figure as the legitimate government, regardless of domestic legitimacy. These figures were not chosen at random. They were selected based on one criterion above all others: willingness to open Venezuela's resources to Western capital. The most recent and most visible of these figures is Maria Corina Machado. Machado has been heavily promoted across Western media as a democratic reformer and freedom fighter. Her image has been carefully crafted viral clips, international awards, and glowing profiles that frame her as the moral opposite of the Venezuelan government. But rhetoric matters less than policy, and when Machado speaks plainly, the mask slips. In public forums, she openly promises to privatize Venezuela's oil, gas, mining, and infrastructure sectors. offering what she herself describes as a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity for foreign investors. She has explicitly stated that Venezuela under her leadership would be fully opened to U.S. corporations, Western financial institutions, and global capital markets. This is not independence. This is liquidation. When asked whether she supports U.S. military pressure or even strikes against Venezuelan territory, her response was unequivocal. Escalation is necessary to force regime change. From Washington's perspective, this is ideal. From a geopolitical perspective, it confirms what this conflict has always been about. The United States did not suddenly turn against Venezuela. This has been a 20-year campaign. Shortly after Hugo Chavez came to power, Washington began imposing sanctions. At first, they were limited, symbolic even. But over time, they expanded into one of the most comprehensive economic warfare campaigns in modern history. Sanctions targeted Venezuela's oil exports, its access to international banking, its ability to import spare parts and medicine, its currency and financial institutions. The stated justification was always the same: corruption, democracy, human rights. But sanctions do not punish governments alone. They punish populations. Combined with internal mismanagement, these sanctions pushed Venezuela into hyperinflation, supply shortages, and economic paralysis. The resulting crisis was then used as evidence that the government itself was illegitimate, creating a self-reinforcing loop. Destabilize the economy, blame the government for the collapse, offer regime change as the solution. This is not a mistake. It is a model. Sanctions are only effective up to a point. When a targeted government survives economic strangulation, the next phase begins: covert operations, infrastructure sabotage, assassinations, cyber warfare. This pattern has already been seen in Iran, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Venezuela is no exception. The recent deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier ever built, is not accidental. This carrier alone can project overwhelming air power deep into Venezuelan territory. The declaration of a no-fly zone is not defensive, it is preparatory. Air dominance always precedes regime change. Washington is testing limits, probing defenses, measuring responses, and it is watching closely to see who intervenes. Unlike Iraq or Libya, Venezuela is not isolated. China has invested over $67 billion in Venezuelan infrastructure and energy projects. These are not symbolic investments, they are long-term strategic commitments. Beijing sees Venezuelan oil as a pillar of its future energy security. Russia provides military equipment, intelligence cooperation, and strategic deterrence. Moscow understands that losing Venezuela would further tighten Western control over global energy markets. Iran, itself, a veteran of sanctions warfare, has advised Venezuela on bypassing restrictions, protecting refineries, and resisting covert sabotage. Together, these relationships form a geopolitical shield, but shields only work if those holding them are willing to stand firm. What makes this confrontation uniquely dangerous is timing. The world is in transition. For nearly a century, global power has been centralized around a single pole, the United States. That era is ending, not suddenly, but unmistakably. Trade is fragmenting, financial systems are diversifying, military power is diffusing. This does not mean America has collapsed. It means America no longer dictates terms unchallenged. The rise of BRICS is not just an economic trend, it is a civilizational shift. Nations that were once subordinate are asserting autonomy. They are rejecting a system where debt equals obedience, resources flow outward. Policy is dictated externally. Venezuela sits at the crossroads of this transformation. If it survives, it strengthens the multipolar world. If it falls, it delays that transition by decades. Previous regime change operations were conducted against states that were militarily weak, strategically isolated, economically dependent. Venezuela is none of these. While its economy has suffered, its geopolitical position has strengthened. It is integrated into alternative trade networks. It has experience surviving sanctions. And it has learned, often painfully, how regime change operations unfold. This makes a clean intervention unlikely. Any direct war risks regional destabilization, energy market shocks. Direct confrontation with rival powers. This is why Washington has escalated cautiously yet relentlessly. For the United States, This moment is existential not in the sense of immediate collapse, but in terms of trajectory. If Washington allows Venezuela to fully integrate into a post-dollar energy system, the petrodollar's decline accelerates. With it goes the ability to finance endless deficits, project power cheaply, and enforce compliance through sanctions. In other words, losing Venezuela means losing leverage. That is why this confrontation feels different. That is why escalation is happening now. That is why restraint is becoming harder to maintain. So the real question is not whether the United States is serious about Venezuela. It is. The real question is whether the world is ready for the consequences. Will Venezuela withstand the pressure? Will China, Russia, and Iran hold their ground? Will the petrodollar survive another decade? Or will this moment mark the point where global power finally shifts irreversibly away from a single empire? Because this is not just another regime change operation. This is do or die for the American system as it exists today. Every empire reaches a moment where strength must be performed rather than assumed. Sun Tzu understood this centuries ago. When power is unquestioned, it is quiet. When power is threatened, it becomes loud. The fleets gather, the narratives sharpen. The pressure builds, and the world watches. Wars, empires, and currencies are connected. Subscribe to History Behind Money to see what they never explain.